Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the second video for Plato's Phaedo. Just a quick recap of sort of where we left off. This is a discussion between Socrates and a few other people, but namely the ones in our reading are Sebes and Simmias. Now we're going to see Simmias take a little bit more of a leading role in this section, and the whole reading is about the nature of how we exist. So whether we exist as just purely a physical body or a body and a soul. Now, we've seen Socrates already present the argument that he thinks we exist as two separate things, and he's talked about how we should focus on doing philosophy, and this keeps our soul ready for returning to the perfect world of being. In this one, we're going to see a response from Simmias, who presents what's called the attunement theory, and then Socrates kind of returning serve on that, and showing that, well, Simmias is kind of contradicting himself from what he agreed to earlier if he supports the attunement theory. So by the end, of course, like any good Plato text, Socrates will win the argument, and Simmias will agree that the soul is not actually like attunement. But let's get started. So reading's out. There is a little start to this section. Now it's crossed out a little bit, so sorry about that, but I'm going to quickly read through the italicized part that starts on page 156. It's got a black line through it, but that's okay. I'm sure you'll be able to cope. So here we go, pens at the ready. So I'm going from the attunement theory. The attunement theory, given that one accepts that there is something constantly in the living body which brings it life, unity, and perception, one is confronted with the following choices. Either it will be some part of the individual distinct from the parts of the body, something which arrives when the body is in a condition apt for life and departs thereafter, whether intact and intelligent or not, or it will be some relation between the rest of the parts of the individual. So really what they're suggesting here is the soul can exist as one of two things. It can either be something that is added to the physical body at the point of life, or it could just be something that comes from the functioning of the parts of the body. In other words, the body comes first and then the soul kind of grows from that. This is sort of like a property dualist argument, that the soul, in this case, just stems from the functioning of the body. Okay, so continuing on, Simmias understands the present theory as being of the latter type, and the attunement or harmony as the lyre's state of being ready to play, with all its parts standing in the correct relation to one another and the string at the correct tension. So Simmias is going to present what we call the attunement theory or the harmony theory, which is that the soul comes from the composition of the body. In other words, it's kind of like a musical instrument where a lyre is a type of instrument, and if we tune the strings to the right pitch, then it will create the correct tune. This is essentially the way that our soul operates with our body. If our body is at the right balance, then it will create the soul. And so thus the soul would be the body's state of being ready to live with all its parts adequately attuned. This section gives a bit of history on the attunement theory. I'll run through it very quickly, but it's not particularly important to our purposes. So this type of theory offers an obvious challenge, since it does not allow the soul to be an independent entity of the type which Socrates advocates, thus threatening the moral theory of the Phaedo, as well as the theory of the soul's immortality. So if the attunement theory is correct, then the soul will not live on after death, because as soon as we destroy an instrument, well, obviously the tune is gone as well. If the strings are all cut, we don't say that the tune, the level of tuning has lived on past the destruction of the physical instrument, of course. So if this is correct, then the soul would be destroyed at the same time that the body is. The soul is some kind of appropriate the origin of the theory may be complex, that the soul is some kind of appropriate mixture of the physical forces hot, cold, wet, dry, was a natural view for the Greek medical theorists to hold. This might sound a little bit weird to our ears, but essentially the Greeks believed that the body was in a state of balance between extremes, and when people got sick, it's because this balance got thrown out. Funnily enough, this is pretty much the theory that existed all the way through the medieval period as well, that we had to maintain this balance of different, what they called humours, in the body, stemming from the Greek medical practice. Thankfully, we're a bit more advanced now. Yet harmonic theory was particularly dear to the Pythagoreans, and the Pythagorean Ecreatus had long adhered to a soul harmony theory, in spite of the Pythagoreans' belief in an afterlife. So we're talking about Pythagoras here, which is, I think I've talked about it in class. Pythagoras was essentially like a cult leader. They worshipped mathematics. They were pretty brutal, but they held to this idea of harmony. They did not have to understand the harmony as Simmias does, and indeed the soul which Plato employs in the Timaeus is very much a harmony without in any sense being an attunement of bodily elements. Since for Pythagoreans mathematical entities were the primary reality, that's right, they worshipped maths, it makes sense that the lyre's harmony should have been an external and independent force attached almost magically into the material lyre as soon as it was ready to be played. In criticizing the doctrine at De Anima, Aristotle implies that the theory was a popular one without specifying any particular advocates of it. So again, just a bit of background on the theory with the Pythagoreans. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. And also Aristotle's response, not particularly important for us. So what we're going to see in this first part is Simmias presenting the attunement theory, and Socrates sort of questioning him about it a little bit, but he's going to let him, Socrates is essentially going to let Simmias dig his own grave. Alright, so here we go. What I mean is this, said Simmias. You might say the same thing about tuning the strings of a musical instrument, that the attunement is something invisible and incorporeal, and splendid and divine, and located in the tuned instrument, while the instrument itself and its strings are material and corporeal and composite and earthly and closely related to what is mortal. So he's suggesting here that we could have, that there's an analogy between a musical instrument and our view of the mind and the body for humans. He's kind of presenting what I've called the ghost in the machine argument here, that the attunement of instruments, or the tuning of the strings of instruments, is actually putting in this mystical element that makes the notes. It's the little man inside the instrument making the sound. It's not actually the strings. Obviously this is, a bit silly, and that's exactly what Simmias wants to point out. We wouldn't suggest that there's some magical property inside a guitar, so why do we think there's a magical property inside us? Now, suppose that the instrument is broken, or its strings cut or snapped. According to your theory, the attunement must still exist. It cannot have been destroyed, because it would be inconceivable that when the strings are broken, the instrument and the strings themselves, which have a mortal nature, should still exist, and the attunement, which shares the nature and characteristics of the divine and immortal, should exist no longer, having predeceased its mortal counterpart. You would say that the attunement must still exist somewhere, just as it was, and that the wood and strings will rot away before anything happens to it. So, Simmias is pointing out here, if we accept this analogy of the musical instruments, a musical instrument being analogous to the body and the soul, well then we have to accept that a guitar could be destroyed, and yet the tune of its strings will live on in some sort of mystical way, because that's essentially what we're saying about the mind and the body. The body may be destroyed and rot and decompose, but the soul will continue to live on. This Simmias is suggesting, this is silly. We don't say this about musical instruments. Why do we say it about ourselves? Well, if the soul is really an adjustment, obviously as soon as... Oh, sorry, I've skipped ahead here, haven't I? Yep, so I think I'm up to... I say this, Socrates, because as I think you yourself are aware, this is very much the kind of thing that we take the soul to be. The body is held together at a certain tension between the extremes of hot and cold and dry and wet and so on, and our soul is a balance or attunement of these same extremes, when they are combined in just the right proportion. So again, this was sort of the scientific belief at the time, that our body was, when it was healthy and functioning well, it was represented by this balance between these opposing forces. So, you know, we were healthiest when we were neither hot nor cold, but a perfect balance of both, that kind of idea. And so the soul and the functioning of the soul is simply the tune that comes from this perfectly tuned body, much like a musical instrument. Well, if the soul is really an adjustment, obviously as soon as the tension of our body is lowered or increased beyond the proper point, the soul must be destroyed, divine though it is, just like any other attunement. So he's pointing out here that you know, if we throw these things out of balance, well then the soul has to be destroyed, just like if we twist the you know, the knobs at the end of a guitar and throw it out of tune, the tune is destroyed. Okay, so either in music or in any product of the arts and crafts, although in each case the physical remains last considerably longer until they are burned up or rot away. Find us an answer to this argument if someone insists that the soul, being a balance of physical constituents, is the first thing to be destroyed by what we call death. So Simmias is sort of challenging Socrates here, big mistake, to identify how we could possibly respond to the attunement theory. So that's where we sort of leave Simmias, and we now go to Socrates' reply. So we skip ahead in the book a little bit, and we see, so in the italicized section now, Socrates replies to Simmias' theory that the soul may be a kind of attunement. The theory is firstly incompatible with the theory of recollection, which is what we're going to be talking about primarily. Secondly, it's inadequate so far as there are degrees of attunement, but not of the soul. And third, inconsistent with the fact that our souls can be well or badly tuned themselves. And four, inconsistent with the soul's role as leader of the body. So Socrates is going to say that, and this connects to something that we didn't necessarily have in the reading, but appears earlier in the Phaedo, that our soul actually remembers things. So the experience of learning something new is not actually learning, according to Socrates. What you're doing is you're remembering. Your soul is remembering what it had experienced in the world of being. You never actually learn anything new. You just remember everything that the soul has. Now, earlier Simmias agreed to this, and Socrates points out that, well, you can't agree with both the recollection theory and the attunement theory, because the recollection theory necessitates that the soul exists before the body. Otherwise, what is it remembering? It must have existed before the body. Whereas the attunement theory says that the soul comes after the body. We have to tune the body before we can have the attunement of the soul. So hopefully that makes sense. Alright, so here we go. We must go ahead, he continued. First, remind me of what you said, if you find my memory inaccurate. Simmias's doubts, I believe, are based on the fear that, though the soul is more divine and a nobler thing than the body, it may nevertheless be destroyed first, as being a kind of attunement. Sebes, on the other hand, appeared to agree with me that soul is more enduring than body, but to maintain that no one can be sure that, after repeatedly wearing out a great many bodies, it does not at last perish itself, leaving the last body behind. And he thinks that death may be precisely this, the destruction of the soul, because the body never stops perishing all the time. Am I right, Simmias and Sebes, in thinking that these are the objections which we have to investigate? They agreed that this was so. So here, Socrates is just sort of summing up the arguments that have been presented by Simmias and Sebes. So Simmias has presented the idea that the soul is actually kind of like an attunement of the body, and so as soon as the body dies, so must the soul, because we can't have tunes living on without the instrument that creates them. Sebes has presented a different argument that perhaps the soul just sort of body hops for a while and then eventually gets worn out and may die, and so it's not necessary that the soul has to exist in another world. But yeah, so let's see Socrates' response here. Well then, he said, do you reject all our previous arguments or only some of them? Only some of them, they said. What is your opinion of that argument by which we claimed that learning is recollection, and that if this is so, our souls must have existed somewhere else before they were confined to the body? Speaking for myself, said Sebes, I found it remarkably convincing at the time, and I stick to it still, as I do to no other theory. Yes, indeed, said Simmias. It is just the same with me. I should be very much surprised if I ever change my opinion about that. So Socrates has already defeated Simmias. He just doesn't realize it, because Simmias has said that the recollection theory, the idea that we never actually learn anything new, we just remember things from our previous world, proves that the attunement theory can't be correct. So yeah, like I said, Simmias has already dug his grave, and Socrates is just about to lead him into it. But you will have to change it, my Theban friend, said Socrates, if your belief still stands that an attunement is a composite thing, so made up of other parts, like, the tuning of the strings of a guitar, and that the soul is an attunement composed of our physical elements at a given tension. I imagine that you would not accept even from yourself the assertion that a composite attunement existed before the elements of which it was to be composed, or would you? Not for a moment, Socrates. So he's basically asking Simmias here, I'm sure that you don't believe that the tune of a guitar exists before the guitar is created? And Simmias is saying, well, no, of course not. That's silly. Don't you see that that is just what it amounts to when you say that the soul exists before it enters the human form or body, and also that it is composed of elements which do not yet exist? Surely an attunement is not at all like the object of your comparison. The instrument and the strings and their attuned sounds come first. The attunement is the last of all to be constituted, and the first to be destroyed. How will this account harmonize with the others? So what he's saying here is, well, you've already said that the soul must exist before the body because it remembers things. Now you're saying it's impossible for the soul to have existed before the body because it comes from the tuning of the body. These two things can't possibly exist. And, yeah, not at all, says Simmias. And yet, said Socrates, if any account ought to be harmonious, it should be an account of attunement. Yes, it should. So Socrates is having a little bit of a laugh here by saying that, well, Simmias's argument has fallen out of harmony with itself, and he was, presenting an argument about tuning and harmony, and he's fallen out of harmony with himself. Ah, Socrates. Yes, it should, said Simmias. Well, said Socrates, this one does not harmonize with your view. Make up your mind which theory you prefer, that learning is recollection or that the soul is attunement. So he can't have both. He must choose. The former, without any hesitation, Socrates, he said. So Simmias, rolls over and dies very quickly here and says, no, the theory of recollection. The other, by that he means the attunement theory, appealed to me without any proof to support it, because it came with a certain likelihood and attractiveness, which is why it appeals to most people. But I realized that theories which rest their proof upon likelihood are impostors, and unless you are on your guard, they deceive you properly, both in geometry and everywhere else. On the other hand, the theory of recollection and learning derives from a hypothesis, which is worthy of acceptance. I'm not sure what proof there is for the recollection theory, because Simmias is saying, well, no, there's no proof for the attunement theory, so I'm going to get rid of it. Well, I'm not entirely sure we've got proof for the recollection theory either, but we'll continue on. It was surely stated that the theory that our soul exists even before it enters the body has the same status as its grasp of that reality of which we say, as it is itself. A view which I have, to the best of my belief, fully and rightly accepted. It seems, therefore, that I must not accept either from myself or from anyone else the assertion that the soul is an attunement. So not only has Simmias given up the argument for attunement, or that the soul is attunement, he's now saying that he won't accept it from himself or anyone else. So in other words, he's pretty much saying, I'll fight anyone who thinks that the soul is attunement. He's come around very quickly to Socrates' way of thinking. There is this way of looking at it too, Simmias, said Socrates. Do you think that an attunement or any other composite thing should be in a condition different from that of its component elements? No, I do not. And it should not act or be acted upon, I presume, differently from them. He agreed. So an attunement should not control its elements, but should follow their lead, he asserted. There is no question of its conflicting with them, either in movement or in sound or in any other way. None at all. So what Socrates is doing here, this is called the Socratic method for those of you who aren't aware of it, is he's getting Simmias to agree to premises that go against the conclusion that he had presented before. Now, Simmias has already given up the fight. He's already said that the recollection theory is correct, and so the attunement theory must be wrong. But Socrates is just trying to show that, well, it's wrong in more than just one way. This one, what he's saying is, well, if we take the attunement theory, it's the tuning of the strings that produces the tune. So the physical then leads the non-physical element, the tune in this case. And so one can't come before the other. In fact, the strings control the tune. And he's going to point out that the soul is the other way around. None at all. Very well then. Is it not the nature of every attunement to be an attunement insofar as it is tuned? I don't understand. Well, that makes two of us, Simmias. Surely, said Socrates, if it is tuned more, that is, in a greater degree, supposing this to be possible, it must be more of an attunement. And if it is tuned less, that is, in a lesser degree, it must be less of an attunement. Quite so. And is this the case with the soul, that one soul is, even minutely, more or less of a soul than another? Not in the least. So what Socrates is saying here is, well, the tuning of an instrument is not a perfect science, and so some instruments can sound in tune, but then you hear another one and you're like, oh, that's more in tune or less in tune. Well, we don't say that about souls. Souls are souls. Someone doesn't have more of a soul than someone else. Their souls might be good or bad, but they're not more or less, whereas an instrument can be more or less in tune. So not in the least. Now please give me your closest attention, said Socrates. Do we say that one kind of soul possesses intelligence and goodness and is good, and that another possesses ignorance and wickedness and is bad? And is this true? Yes, it is true. Then how will the person who holds that the soul is an attunement account for the presence in it of goodness and badness? Will he describe them as yet another attunement, or a lack of it? Will he say that the good soul is in tune, and not only is an attunement itself, but contains another, whereas the bad soul is out of tune and does not contain another attunement? So what Socrates is saying here is, if we can have good souls and bad souls, does that mean a good soul is tuned correctly within itself? So the body is tuned correctly to produce the soul, and then a good soul is tuned correctly in some other way to produce a good soul. Whereas a bad soul, the body is tuned correctly to produce a soul, but then the soul is tuned incorrectly to itself to create a bad soul. This can lead to an argument of infinite regression, because if you say, well, yes, it must be in tune with something else as well, well, then does it have to be in tune with something else, and something else, and something else, and something else? Where does it end? So there's a few issues with this attunement theory. I really could not say, replied Simmias, but obviously anyone who held that view would have to say something of the sort. But we've already agreed, said Socrates, that no soul can be more or less of a soul than another, and this is tantamount to agreeing that it can be no more or less of an attunement, nor can it be an attunement in a greater or lesser degree. Is that not so? Certainly. That what is neither more nor less of an attunement is neither more nor less in tune. Is that so? Yes. Does that which is neither more nor less in tune contain a greater or smaller proportion of attunement, or an equal one? An equal one. Then, since no soul is any more or less than just a soul, it is neither more or less in tune. That is so. Under this condition, it cannot contain a greater proportion of discord or attunement. Certainly not. And again, under this condition, can one soul contain a greater proportion of badness or goodness than another, assuming that badness is discord and goodness attunement? No, it cannot. So here Socrates is sort of running through, basically pointing out all the differences between the soul and attune. It can't be more or less. It is a soul. Everyone's soul is a soul. It's a bit repetitive and roundabout, but or rather, I suppose, Simmias, by strict reasoning, no soul would contain any share of badness if it is an attunement, because surely since attunement is absolutely attunement, and nothing else, it can never contain any share of discord. No, indeed. Nor can the soul, since it is absolutely soul, contain a share of badness. No, in the light of what we have said. So on this theory, every soul of every living creature will be equally good, assuming that it is the nature of all souls to be equally souls and nothing else. I think that follows Socrates. So, in other words, all souls are equal, and assuming that the souls are naturally disposed to good, all souls are equally good. Do you also think that this view is right? Would the argument ever have come to this if our hypothesis that the soul is an attunement had been correct? Not the least chance of it. Well, said Socrates, do you hold that it is any other part of a man than the soul that governs him, especially if he is a wise one? No, I do not. So by governs him, we're talking about, well, which one controls the other? Does the soul control the body, or the body control the soul? Remember, the soul is said to be divine, so perfect. And so it's not going to be driven by the body. It's going to be, it's going to drive the body. It's going to be the governor. Does it yield to the feelings of the body or oppose them? I mean, for instance, that when a person is feverish and thirsty, it impels him the other way, not to drink, and when he is hungry, not to eat. And there are thousands of other ways in which we see the soul opposing the physical instances. Is that not so? Certainly. So this seems a little bit weird, but just to clarify what Socrates is saying here is the soul is able to get you to disregard the physical demands of the body. So some of you may be hungry hearing this right now, and you're probably sitting there going, look, there's not much longer to go, just stick with it, and then you can have something to eat afterwards. Well, if your physical body was driving, then as soon as you got hungry, you just get up and go get something to eat. As soon as you wanted anything physically, you would stop what you're doing and do it. But because your soul hopefully wants to get to the end of this video, it is saying no. We can resist the body, so it is the decider. Did we not also agree a little while ago that if it is an attunement, it can never sound a note that conflicts with the tension or relaxation or vibration or any other condition of its constituents, but may always follow them and never direct them? Yes, we did, of course. So in other words, the tune comes from the tuning of the strings, not the other way around. Again, this is contradictory to the idea that the soul drives the body. Well, surely we can see now that the soul works in just the opposite way. It directs all the elements of which it is said to consist, opposing them in almost everything all through life, and exercising every form of control. Sometimes by severe and unpleasant methods like those of physical training and medicine, and sometimes by milder ones, sometimes threatening, sometimes warning, and conversing with the desires and passions and fears as though it were quite separate and distinct from them. It is just like Homer's description in the Odyssey, where he says that Odysseus then beat his breast and thus reproved his heart, "Endure, my heart, still worse hast thou endured." So what Socrates is saying here is that our soul is kind of the disciplinarian of our body. No one wants to get up and work out, for example, but our soul desires to be good, and so it is trying to train the body to be good as well, and so our soul forces us to do it. It forces our physical body to get up and do some training. Sometimes harshly, sometimes more kindly. Sometimes we can talk ourselves into doing things. Other times we have to force ourselves into doing things. The analogy with medicine is a good example. Medicine is often not very pleasant to take, but it does help. From a physical point of view, the body's point of view, we wouldn't want to take the medicine. It tastes bad. Okay? But our soul is able to sort of override those physical desires of the body. Do you suppose that when he wrote that he thought that the soul was an attunement, liable to be swayed by physical feelings? Surely he regarded it as capable of leading and controlling them, as something much too divine to rank as an attunement. That is certainly how it seems to me, Socrates. Good. In that case, there is no justification for our saying that soul is a kind of attunement. We should neither agree with Homer nor be consistent ourselves. That is so. So if we're going to take this idea that the soul drives the body, well, then it's not an attunement of the body, because it must come beforehand, and it tunes the body. It doesn't respond to the tuning of the body, if that makes sense. Hopefully that was clear enough. There'll be one more video with Plato's Phaedo. Like and subscribe. See you guys in class.